a little bit about my background, and then we'll quickly get into the topic at hand. There's a few things up here that might be relevant. Maybe these numbers are one. I went to Brown. Actually, John and I both share that number in being both proud members of the class of '87. I have two kids who are here. One is a senior, some of you may know, and then a first-year student too as well. What John and I also share is the class with my the woman who became my wife, and so she's also class of '87, so I have a lot to owe to that class. And my mother-in-law went to Brown, so like lots of Brown graduation numbers up here. And so I've been affiliated with Brown for quite some time. I studied history, and maybe like Henry can attest, history is a really wonderful thing to study. And I'm a big proponent, as I know John is, of studying any form of liberal art. And I say that generally as good preparation for life in general, and in particular as good preparation for entrepreneurship. And I think you'll hear some of that liberal art emphasis theme throughout what I'm going to share with you today. I went to Harvard Business School, and so I have a little bit of traditional business training, and I worked at Procter & Gamble between the 2 years of business school and then after business school for a little while. Enough to do a couple things. One is to know that big corporate environments are not a good fit for me. But also, as you'll hear and see through a couple of what I think are entertaining, and my students can tell you memorable P&G product examples, it was a really good place to learn a lot, which, although I would say it was the least entrepreneurial place I've ever been, was really good training in ways that I didn't appreciate at the time for entrepreneurship. And so I think you'll see that in some of the examples I share with you. I'm a fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts. Anybody ever hear of that except for my students? I hadn't heard of it either until a couple of years ago when this society from London approached me and they said, "We'd like you to become a fellow. Our mission is to promote the arts around the world, and we're looking to include entrepreneurship as an art, and we'd like you to become a fellow." And I hadn't heard of them. I was a little bit skeptical, and they said, "Well, let us tell you, we've been around since the mid-18th century, and in the 1700s, the head of the Royal Society for the Arts was Benjamin Franklin." And I said, "Okay, you got me. You don't have to tell me much more than that." And so I spent a little time working with that group, and I'm proud to be a member. I think much more relevant for today, and I'll fill in some of these details and then we'll move on to the subject at hand, but I figured for those of you who don't know me, maybe it's relevant. Most important maybe on your mind is, what the heck do you know about entrepreneurship? And the way I always like to start is, and I think John would attest to this too, teaching entrepreneurship is a participation sport. It's not a spectator sport. And so I like to point out that when I was essentially your age, I was studying history, and I fell into this opportunity to be part of the leadership team of a new software company that was being spawned out of Brown. And I knew nothing about software. I didn't even know how to turn on a computer. And I knew virtually nothing about business or I'm not sure I even knew the word entrepreneurship. And yet a really Brown experience. We built that venture up with some support from Brown and raised a bunch of money from others. And eventually, a few years later, in the late '80s, we sold that company to Apple. And sometimes I have to clarify to people your age that there were computers in the late '80s. And you may not even realize that, but there were. And Apple took an interest in what we were doing. And so that set me on the path of doing entrepreneurship, which is a lot of what I've done in my career. I do teach entrepreneurship. I've been teaching entrepreneurship, I think, for exactly the years that John has, about 15 years. I got this fateful tap on the shoulder from Barrett Hazeltine. I'm sure many of you know Barrett Hazeltine. Many of us have a lot to be thankful for in terms of our getting to know him. And he knew something in me that I didn't even know in myself. He said, "You'd be a really good teacher. How would you like to come back to Brown and teach entrepreneurship?" And I did at first wonder, why me? I told him, "I think you have the wrong guy." And he said, no, I think you'd be a really good teacher. And then I paused and I said, what do you mean teach entrepreneurship? Is that even a thing? Is that possible to do? And it got me thinking a little bit about not only in general, but how do you teach entrepreneurship at a place like Brown, which is dominantly a liberal arts environment? And we're going to talk a little bit about that and the different steps in teaching entrepreneurship that I devised and that I employ in my teaching. And that eventually, 3.5 years ago, led to the launch of this Nelson Center. Before we even had a building, I was asked to become the initial director of this center. And then the coaching part is I continue to stay involved. As I said, teaching entrepreneurship is a participation sport. And so I'm actively involved with a portfolio of startups that are all over the world, actually. My faculty position at Brown is that I'm a professor of the practice, which requires me to practice. And so I can't do that daily in terms of helping to actually run a company, but I do that in terms of being an active coach. And then I do this kind of teaching, these what I would call workshops, in places all over the world. In some cases, places where I have to find them on a map, because I never heard of them or didn't know where to find them. I didn't know where Bahrain was before the US Embassy asked me to go there and teach these kinds of workshops. I didn't know really where Slovenia was. I've now been there 5 times. The first time I went there, I was asked to go with a group of Brown students, and then several more times leading these kinds of workshops. Sometimes the mission is a little bit more grandiose than starting a company. In fact, just at lunch today, I was having lunch to catch up with a woman who runs a big part of a group that you may be familiar with called Seeds of Peace. And Seeds of Peace mission is really to develop opportunities for dialogue among Palestinians and Israelis and now many other groups through initially a camp for teenagers. And I work with the alumni groups who now, 20 years later after camp and others, are looking to still promote world peace, or at least Middle East peace. So sometimes the mission associated with entrepreneurship is much bigger, much more significant than simply starting a new venture. Okay, I want to set some basic intentions. My students who are here today know that I always do this just because I want to make sure that you've dedicated some time to being here today, and I want to make sure that it's going to be really useful to you. So here are 3 simple things. And I want you to take just 2 seconds to, or maybe 10 seconds to read through these and digest them. Okay, I'm not going to belabor these, but I do want to make sure we point out this one because, you know, all learning does grow out of participation. So it's important for us all to be comfortable about injecting and responding, because I'm going to ask some questions that I hope you'll respond to. All right, I'm not going to quiz you on this, and probably I would disqualify my own students. I hope that you'll be able to respond in some ways after you give others a chance, but I'm not going to quiz you on exactly whether you remember the definition of entrepreneurship. But what I am going to ask you is, what are some words or thoughts that come to mind when I say that word entrepreneurship? What are some words or thoughts that, and there's no right or wrong answers, it's simply a question of what comes to mind. So when I say the word entrepreneurship, what do you think of? Yeah.
Creative.
Creative, okay, so that suggests you're creating something, maybe from scratch. Good, yeah.
Solving a problem.
Solving a problem. You have seen my slides before, perhaps, because that's a good indication of what we're going to emphasize. Yeah.
Meeting a need.
Meeting a need, okay. So that's also a good way to ground our thinking. So not just creating anything. You can be creative in a lot of ways, but maybe meeting a specific need that could solve a problem. What else? What other word? Again, no right or wrong answers. Hannah.
Opportunity and risk.
Opportunity and risk. 2 big, important concepts that are often on the minds of entrepreneurs. Yeah, so if we're going to be creative, if we're going to solve a problem, if we're going to meet a need, we're going to do that in a way that might present an opportunity, and it also might be that it's something, an opportunity where you're going to be risking something. maybe one more? Yeah.
Managing teams and resources.
Okay, so managing, and maybe teams are a form of resources, so resources may be part of taking a risk that we think of. So I'm going to share with you, I hope, a review for my students. I typically feel like by the end of a semester with me, I could wake you up in the middle of the night and say, what's the definition of entrepreneurship? And G, for example, it would just roll off her tongue. She would say, a structured process for solving problems without regard to the resources currently controlled. Now, there is a lot in there, and if we had a lot of time, like a semester, we could unpack every detail. The part that I often find surprises people, and maybe for those of you who haven't heard me articulate this definition, it might surprise you. This is often, especially in other parts of the world, the part of this definition that people find surprising. Structured process. Because a lot of times people envision entrepreneurship as not a structured process, not structured at all. In fact, not a process. Sometimes you may have, how many of you have ever heard the phrase entrepreneurial spirit? Yeah, many of us have heard that, yeah. I've heard that a lot, and I remember when I had that consequential phone call with Barrett Hazeltine right after I realized, oh, I've agreed to teach Brown students entrepreneurship. What does that mean? I thought, well, it can't be that I have to teach them entrepreneurial spirit, because I've heard of that, but I don't really even know what it means. And I certainly don't know how to teach somebody a spirit. So instead I began to think, well, you know, at Brown, as you all know, we don't have a business school. And I actually think that's a good thing. It doesn't narrow our thinking, doesn't narrow our definition, narrow our focus about what entrepreneurship is. And at Brown, especially back then, a lot of the entrepreneurship teaching that was happening, and there was not nearly as much as now, but some was happening in the engineering school. And I was being asked to teach an entrepreneurship course technically in the engineering school. And I thought about it for a while, and I realized, you know, imagine if when we were teaching somebody how to build a bridge in engineering, we said to them, you know what, just go out there and have the bridge building spirit. That would be a little bit wacky. We would lose our accreditation. You know, imagine if you said to people, just go throw up a bridge and hope that it holds up the cars and the trucks. Just have a lot of bridge building spirit. And if it doesn't and they come crashing down to earth, then be persistent and try again. And yet I thought that that's essentially the way a lot of people were trying to coach others on how to be an entrepreneur. Just go out there and have the entrepreneurial spirit. And so I realized in bridge building, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end to building any bridge. You can distill some fundamental principles that we could then teach to somebody, they could master, and then they could go out and apply to building any kind of bridge, leaving a lot of room for all sorts of variation. No one bridge is exactly like any other, but every bridge building follows some fundamental principles. And so I thought about teaching entrepreneurship the same way, that instead of this amorphous spirit, we could distill out some fundamental entrepreneurial process principles, and we could teach somebody a method, a process that they could learn, they could master, and then they could apply. Similarly, leaving lots of room for variation of all kinds. No one startup is exactly like any other. And the three steps that I thought about for a while in my own learning at HBS and also in my own entrepreneurship were these three steps. These are the fundamental principles. One is, first, is find and validate an unmet need, which basically means if this is a structured process for problem solving, we better start with what the problem is that we're looking to solve in the first place. And this is by no means a trivial step. In fact, what we're going to learn today in the next few minutes is it's the most important part of the whole process. The second step is to develop what I call a value proposition, which essentially means on a small scale to begin with, through an iterative process, what's the initial approach to solving this problem that we devised in the first step? And then eventually, and I find that students in particular sometimes have a challenge in this third step, where I call it creating a sustainability model, a method of having a sustained impact over the long term and having impact at scale, having a really big impact. And sometimes, again, especially students, have a little bit of a challenge thinking through how they can have big impact. But it's these three steps that I distilled into this methodology of fundamentally about solving problems. And I highlight this first step because, as I say, it's the most important part of the process, and it's the part that we're going to focus on for the next few minutes. Okay. Bill Salmon is a really well-respected, I would call him a guru of teaching at HBS, one of my mentors. So I have enormous respect for Bill. Bill says this, that opportunity is everywhere and all sorts of sources of opportunity. And I think to some extent he's right. But if I just told you that, and maybe others have told you that, I suspect it wouldn't be terribly empowering. In fact, it might even be a little bit frustrating. Just because opportunity is everywhere doesn't mean that you're armed or empowered with a skill set, a methodology that you can use to actually find and validate those opportunities. So the good news is maybe opportunity is everywhere. The bad news is just hearing that isn't terribly useful. So when I travel and do workshops all over the world, I like to ask people, when you are looking for a new opportunity to address, to embrace, to start up through the method of entrepreneurship, how do you do that? And usually what I hear from people is some form of what I call top-down research. And top-down research is pre-packaged secondary research that somebody else has packaged for you. And in my day, in John's day, they used to publish this data, these numbers, this analysis in books and in journals. And they used to house it in these big buildings that they have on campus called libraries. And my suspicion is you may not be quite as familiar with those as John and I were in our day. But I suspect, and I know, because some of you are my former students, that as 20, 21, 22-year-olds, you are awesome at doing top-down research. You just do it in a different method. You could search on your iPhone or on your computer for some basic data, some numbers that somebody else has prepackaged for you that'll tell you something about whether an industry area is worth investigating. And so these are numbers that you all are familiar with. So let's, for example, say you are interested in pursuing an opportunity for a startup, for entrepreneurship in the pet food industry. Well, one number that you could probably find within 10 seconds on your iPhone would be, how big is that market? I'm not asking you to do it, but I think you could probably do that kind of top-down secondary research really easily. What are some other numbers if I asked you, if I charged you to go find out some basic data, top-down research about the pet food industry, in addition to how big is the market as a whole? What are some other numbers that you might be able to go find? Yeah.
Like the number of key competitors and what their market share is?
Great. So this isn't a new area, it's an existing area, so there are probably people not just aggregating a total market, but maybe their competitors already doing some, and as you say, occupying specific market share. What else? Yeah.
What the margins might be of profits.
Okay, something about the financial numbers. Yeah, what else? What else might you be able to find if you ran out there and did some of this basic research?
How fast the market's growing.
Okay, so not only how big is it, but it may be growing really fast or maybe shrinking fast. So that could be a problem or a good thing or a new opportunity. Jay?
Market concentration.
Okay, so how among all these competitors, how many, is it consolidated, is it fragmented? Yeah, so you guys could win the top-down research Olympics, I suspect, if I charged you with, in the next little bit of time, go do some basic secondary research to find things like how big is a market, how fast is it growing, how might we segment it? So it's not just the entire market in aggregate, but dogs, cats, equine, chinchillas, whatever kind of segmentation of that market you might consider. So yeah, and then there's other things like who might the potential customers be? Who might we actually sell some of our products to? And then as Georgia says, who might those competitors be who are already in that market? And that's the kind of research, again, that you're used to doing probably since you were in grade school. And again, what is usually a skill set that you are great at because you're students at Brown and you do a really good job of it. The problem is, even though I hear pretty consistently, no matter where I go around the world, whether I'm in China or Bahrain or Jordan or London, when I ask people, how do you go out there and find or validate an opportunity? It's usually this kind of top-down research that people tell me. And the problem in my experience and most of my students' experience is it's not actually all that useful. In fact, in some ways, being dependent on that at the exclusion of other kinds of research is worse than if you didn't do any at all. But at least it's safe to say that even if it's necessary, which it might be, it's by no means sufficient. So if top-down research isn't really the best way to find and validate a new opportunity, or at least a need, what I'm here to share with you in the next few minutes is something that's really the opposite. It's called bottom-up research. And a shorthand way of describing that is market-inspired entrepreneurship. So let's dive in a little bit and understand what we mean by bottom-up research. So remember, we're talking about this first part of the entrepreneurial process, where all we're looking to do to begin with is to find and validate unmet needs, basically identifying what problem we're looking to solve. And one thing that's important to caveat or emphasize is that not all needs are created equal. I think you would agree. So what I'm looking for when I'm doing this, or what I'd like you to look for when you're doing this first part of the process of finding and validating unmet needs, is to look for needs that are strong and enduring. Strong and enduring. Now, why do you think I will qualify the needs that we're ideally looking for? Why not weak and whimsical? So why do we think I say strong? Let's start with that one. Why do you think strong is an important qualification of the needs we're looking for? Why strong? Oscar.
Is there maybe a higher demand for it?
Okay, so there might be a higher propensity for somebody to want to solve that problem, right? My friend who's a venture capitalist likes to say he would rather invest in a venture that's addressing a hair on fire need. Because if your hair is on fire, you really need a bucket of water to put it out. And so the statistics these days are that every single day we are exposed to approximately 5,000 marketing messages that are looking for our attention, that are telling us that we should pay attention to their solution to our problem that is addressing a really significant need. So our defenses are up, and we're not apt necessarily to pull our credit card out of our pocket every time somebody promises to address a need. But we are much more likely, as Oscar says, to pull our credit card out if what you have is something that's going to address a strong need rather than a weak need. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't build a successful venture out of a weak need or even not a need. We can all think of a venture, or maybe many, that are addressing a want, not even a need. But all things being equal, why not look for a strong need versus a weak? Now, why do you think I say enduring? Enduring is a different kind of concept. Why not faddish or whimsical? Why enduring? Yes, Jay.
So you can work on promoting that long-term sustainability?
Yes, exactly. So now you're pointing to that third step in the process, which is develop a sustainability model so you can have long-term impact and grow to the point where you're having big impact at a big scale. Great. Yeah, all things being equal, why not invest our time, our money, our pedigree, our education, our reputation, our relationships on something that's going to have a long-term yield rather than a short-term? Again, we can think of exceptions, but in general, the kinds of needs we're going to look for in this first step of this three-step process are strong and enduring. Okay, so what do you think I mean more specifically by bottom-up research? Here's one shorthand way I like to describe what I mean. How many of you have ever taken an anthropology course? Anybody? You have. Rose. So a few years ago, I was asked to go teach in Portugal with a world-class anthropologist at Brown named Lina Frusetti. Have you taken a class with Lina Frusetti? You haven't. I recommend everybody take a class with Lina Frusetti. I knew nothing about anthropology. She knew nothing about entrepreneurship, but we paired up and we taught a really good course in Portugal. And one of the things I learned, and maybe, Rose, you already know this, is that anthropologists are really good at doing what they call ethnographic research. And what that means is anthropologists are great at observing and listening to people behave naturally in their own environments without intervening in a way that is going to change that behavior. They're just looking to observe and listen to people behaving normally and naturally in their own environments. And so I shorthand my definition of bottom-up research by saying, be an anthropologist. The second word that I think is really a crucial signal to what I mean by bottom-up research is this word, empathize, or empathy. And I love when I travel in different cultures to ask people, what do you mean by empathy? What's a metaphor you might use to explain empathy? And I hear different ones depending on where I am around the world. What's a Western form of metaphor that we often use to describe empathy or empathize? What's a Western culturally based one? Yeah.
Put yourself in their shoes.
Put yourself in someone else's shoes. Hannah hit it right on the nose. Thank you for sharing that with us. Exactly. Now, what does that mean? That's a metaphor. So how do you describe what it literally means? You don't mean literally try on somebody else's shoes, do you?
Psychologically put yourself in the mindset of what the person's experiencing.
Great. You couldn't have said it better. So psychologically put yourself in the mindset of what that other person is experiencing. Now, you're actually not saying agree with it. You're also not saying disagree with it. Just put yourself in their shoes so you can understand what that person is experiencing and feeling. Now, I noticed you didn't say judge somebody else's shoes, right? Your shoes are so 2016. No, that's not what you're saying. You didn't say, I've got a better pair of shoes I can sell you, right? You're not pitching them on a new pair of shoes. There'll be time for that perhaps later, but all you're doing, I like the way you said that, Hannah, was to psychologically understand what the other person is experiencing. And that's all we're looking to do now. Again, like an anthropologist, not judge what the other person is experiencing, simply understand it and to be able to empathize with it, okay? So again, by bottom-up research, we're talking about observing and listening, and here's an important caveat, don't pitch. Now that's an important caveat, an important discipline that I always especially emphasize for a room full of, and I presume to some extent you are all aspiring entrepreneurs or actual entrepreneurs. By the way, I consider myself one of you. And I know even for myself, it is really hard to have the discipline at any stage of this entrepreneurial process, but especially at this first stage, when all we're doing is looking for the problem to solve, to avoid the temptation to pitch. Why do you think? Why is that a hard thing for aspiring entrepreneurs who are all excited to avoid? Why do I caveat that? Yeah.
There might be something in particular you want to hear.
Okay, so we're biased and we may be looking to lead the witness. Exactly. That's one thing. Why else? Why else might we be so excited to go out there and pitch when we are interacting with people, even in these early stages? Jay?
Because you probably have an idea and you're probably excited about that idea, but if you don't take the time to actually listen and observe, you may miss the true root of the problem.
So even both of those are really important. The first part is exactly at the root of why we're excited. Because we think we've got something, even in a really embryonic stage. And why mess with all this Warshay process? I just want to go out there and pitch it to somebody. But you're right, the important caveat is we may actually miss the root of the problem. So I say be careful about pitching, especially in these early days. And the real reason, too, beyond all of the good reasons you've both mentioned, is there's really nothing to pitch. There's no solution on the table. All we're doing in this earliest stage is looking for the problem. And so avoid the temptation, and I'm not preaching, I'm telling myself this too, avoid the temptation to go out there way prematurely and pitch people on a solution, because really what you would be in that case is a solution in search of a problem. And that's really dangerous. Okay, a couple of additional quick caveats. No surveys or focus groups. I'll tell you why in a second. And this may surprise you too, although it may relate to both what Jay and Chuck said, no feedback. And so why do I caveat these additional warnings? Well, why no surveys? I put this warning in here a few years back when I was doing this training at Google in Tel Aviv. And I realized Google people have access to a very powerful survey engine, and by default might be thinking that really what I'm asking them to do is go surveys. And I am saying do not do surveys, maybe ever, no disrespect to Google, but especially in this very earliest part of the process. And again, the other reason I say no surveys is because I would find that occasionally I would be doing this training, people would come back to me and say, hey, Danny, I'm really excited to tell you that I did some bottom-up research. I went out there and I did a Survey Monkey. And I'd say, whoa, what did I say in this bottom-up research training that led you to believe that surveys are a legitimate way of doing bottom-up research? And in fact, that's not at all. The reason is surveys are not an anthropological way, an empathetic way, an authentic way of getting at the root of how people behave naturally. It's not observing and listening to people behave naturally. It's the opposite. It's about the most contrived way I can imagine to ask people to respond to a framed set of questions that are biased in their nature and that are limiting the way that people are going to respond to you. So don't do surveys. The other is focus groups. You can imagine focus groups are also not a natural way for people to behave. They're people just gathered around a table, usually dominated by one or two people. You are framing the questions. You're not observing them or listening to them behave anthropologically. And so the last caveat, which sometimes surprises people, is avoid the temptation to ask for feedback. And usually if you ask for feedback, especially at this really early stage, you're going to get big thumbs up, lots of enthusiasm, especially because you may be asking people in your own cohort, your family, your friends. And why do you think they're giving you big thumbs up? What do you imagine? They want to make you feel good. What's it cost them to tell you your idea is great? Why would they want to tell you your idea sucks? And in fact, the reality is there's no idea yet. All we're doing is looking for the problem, not proposing a solution. The other might be that you get big thumbs down. And it's because it really is embryonic, what you're trying to ask for feedback on. And maybe people do feel defensive, and they don't like that you're asking them for feedback, and they tell you your idea does suck. And it may, because it's way premature to be proposing a solution when we don't even know the problem yet. You with me? Okay. Now, if you do this well, if you do bottom-up research well, I even quantify the extent to which you should be listening and observing. And I always say that in our interactions with people doing bottom-up research, we should be, the Rorschach litmus test is, are we listening at least 80% of the time? And it might mean we are listening 100% of the time, which is kind of the definition of observing. So if you want to check yourself to know, am I doing this right? Ask very open-ended questions and listen. And you might not even ask anything and simply observe. And I'm going to share with you a few examples that'll document that. Okay. Now usually, no matter where I am, I could be in Jordan or rural China or in Ramallah, Palestine, or in Tel Aviv, Israel. At this part of this training, I get some pretty reliable nodding, but I also can tell that it doesn't seem that complicated. How hard could this be? All I'm asking you to do is keep your eyes and ears open, go observe and listen, and don't intervene in a way that's going to change somebody's behavior. Well, I'm going to tell you that observing is harder than you think. And I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to do that in two ways. First, I'm going to share with you a short video. Very short. It's like 10 seconds. It's going to go by very quickly. Some of you have seen this, I know, because you're in my class, so please don't shout out the answer. But those of you who haven't, focus on what's happening in this short video. I'm going to show you a video of people throwing basketballs to each other. Half the people in the video are wearing white shirts, and your job is to focus on them and count how many times they throw the basketball to each other. And half the group is wearing black shirts, and your job is to focus on the people wearing white shirts. It's going to go by really quickly. And again, your job is simply to count the number of times that the people wearing white are passing the basketball to each other.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted.
Okay, I know you're all guests at the Nelson Center, and I'm a guest to your class, and I wouldn't want to be rude and put anybody on the spot, but on average, the research suggests that half of you missed that gorilla. And I could tell from some of your reactions that some of you missed that gorilla. I will also admit that I personally, the first time I saw that, missed that gorilla. And I wondered, that had to be a trick. How could that have just happened? That I was staring at this big screen and a gorilla just walked in front of my face and I didn't see it. Well, observing is harder than you think. And why? Well, I primed you. I said, focus on the people wearing white shirts and pay very close attention to count their basketball passes. The truth is, we are all biased in all sorts of ways. We are fraught with racial bias, gender bias, age bias, ethnic bias, cultural bias, bias based on expertise. And that's just because we're human. And so if you think that observing and listening to people behave naturally is an easy thing, it's actually much harder than you think. And so a challenge is to be aware of that bias and to relax it as much as possible. Here's another example. There was a group of researchers in Boston who wanted to ask Harvard-trained radiologists to look at some lung tissue under a microscope. These are board-certified radiologists, real experts in their field. And they said, we're going to show you some lung tissue like you're used to seeing anywhere, and we want you to tell us if you see anything unusual. So they showed them this slide, and they said, take a look at the lung tissue in this slide. What do you notice? Well, 83% of these board-certified radiologists, really smart people who look at this kind of lung tissue every day of their life, missed this. Now, I'm not sure why everything is a gorilla, but that's pretty shocking, isn't it? That, you know, not a little rounding error, but 83%, like almost all of them, missed a gorilla in the upper right-hand corner of a piece of lung tissue. And why? Well, these people are biased. They're used to seeing lung tissue look a certain way. In fact, they are a good reflection of one of the other principles I teach, which is the benefits of scarce resources, the burden of abundant resources. These radiologists knew too much to be able to notice this gorilla in the upper right-hand corner, not enough. It reminds me of, you're familiar with the Casper Mattress Company? So founders of that company were in my 1010 class a few years ago. And I always like to say that the reason they've been so successful in completely overhauling the mattress buying business is that they knew less, not that they knew more than the incumbent experts in the mattress business. I like to say the only thing they knew about a mattress is that you sleep on it. And so be careful about knowing too much in a field or having all sorts of other bias that can overwhelm the fresh way in which we could anthropologically and empathetically view and observe and listen to find and validate an unmet need. Okay, I want to share 2 quick quotes with you, and then I'm going to share 3 quick examples. One is by Isaac Asimov. Some of you are familiar with him as an author, I'm sure. And it says, "The most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, but rather, that's funny." And the reason I emphasize this is that it's almost never that you're going to be doing bottom-up research and a lightning bolt is going to hit you out of the blue and smack you over the head, and you're going to know with perfect clarity exactly what a problem is. It's much more likely that you're going to see this weird gorilla walking in front of your field of view, and you're not going to know what to make of it. But our job is just to take note and to maybe record it and remember that, that's funny moment. Because it's typical that if you experience one of these, that's funny moments, that's when you know you're doing bottom-up research right. Here's another quote I love. It's by Albert Einstein. And he says, "If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes." And bottom-up research requires the same disproportionate investment up front into framing what problem you're looking to solve. And that's why I say the most important part of this process is step number 1, find and validate an unmet need. If you do that well, if you invest the time and effort it takes to frame the question correctly, then the 2 next steps of developing a small-scale value proposition solution and eventually developing a sustainability model that enables you to have long-term big impact at scale, those work fabulously. And if you don't do that well, if you don't frame the proper question to ask initially, and you don't know what problem you're solving, then nothing else matters. And you've built a venture on a flimsy foundation. So I think both the Isaac Asimov and the Albert Einstein quotes are really instructive for bottom-up research. Now I'm going to share with you very briefly a little bit of data. We're on a college campus, so I've learned that that's the coin of the realm. And here are the top reasons that startups fail. The number 1 reason is ignoring customers. Now that may be shocking. And I'm not here to say that we should always just swallow whole what our customers tell us. You're going to see in a second an example of that. But ignoring them is probably not a good recipe for success. And yet, that's not buried somewhere down here in the noise. That is the number 1 reason that startups fail. And number 2, which is, to me, just a perfect advertisement for the value of bottom-up research, is no market need. And again, that's surprising. I could imagine maybe it's one of the lower level reasons, but it's the second most common and most significant reason that startups fail. And that suggests that lots of things are what I said before we want to shy away from, solutions in search of a problem. And that's the opposite of what we're looking for. Okay, I'm going to share with you 3 quick examples. And I guarantee you my students who are here now know it and know these examples so well that they will never forget them. And I hope that that will be the case for you. And I don't even have to hope that hard because I've been sharing these examples for about 15 years. And I still get students who come back to me years later at a reunion and they say, do you still tell the Tide example? I'll never forget that. These examples are fun, they're interesting, I think, even a little bit entertaining and very memorable. And they will show you concretely why bottom-up research is so essential. Tide, most people know, is the largest brand at P&G. Here's some of those P&G examples from my own training coming to this training here. It's the largest brand at P&G. At the time of this example, it had been around for 30 years already. And Tide laundry detergent came in powdered form in cardboard boxes. And the Tide team is always doing bottom-up research well past the first part of the process. And they wanted to know, what did people think of the cardboard box packaging? And they did a good job of listening to people really well. In fact, they did a good job of following that Warshay litmus test of listening more than 80% of the time. And for the most part, people were fine with the way the packaging worked. They said, yeah, the cardboard box works great. But the Tide brand people were smart. They didn't believe the consumers they were talking to. And they asked permission. They said, could we come into your house and watch you interact with this product? And a number of people said, sure, no problem. And this one woman who had said, I'm fine with the cardboard box, pulls the box out of a bag, puts it on the counter, pulls open a drawer, pulls out a very sharp knife, and she stabs the side of the box and starts boring a little hole in the box and starts pouring out the powder into a measuring cup. And the Tide brand people were watching this and they were horrified. They couldn't understand what's wrong with this crazy woman stabbing the side of our packaging. And the woman herself looked confused because she said, I don't understand. This is the way I've always used your product for 30 years. And guess what? I'm actually perfectly fine with the way that product works. So that insight led eventually to the development of not only a different package, but a completely different product form factor, Liquid Tide. Now, there are a few really salient points that come from that example. One is, as I said, the Tide people had been doing bottom-up research and had been selling their product for 30 years. And these are some of the most knowledgeable people about laundry detergent in the world. And they didn't know that people were opening their package with a knife. The second insight is they actually did a good job of listening to people. They followed that Warshay litmus test of listening more than 80% of the time. And that alone didn't elicit enough insight to tell them that there was a problem with the way that people were interacting with this product. It took going a step beyond just asking people and observing them anthropologically, empathetically, to see for themselves that there was a problem. And that leads us to the third, probably most important insight of this little case, which is that the woman herself didn't know she had a problem. And just asking her wasn't enough for her to recognize that she did. So observing led them to understand that there really was a problem. It's not her responsibility to inform us of the problem. It's certainly not her responsibility to solve that problem. Okay, real quickly, second P&G example, dishwashing liquid, Dawn dishwashing liquid. Everybody kind of knows what that's about. Same drill, they went into people's houses, they watched people use Dawn dishwashing liquid, and a weird thing happened. A number of people, and it became a pretty big number as they started to observe more throughout the country, were using Dawn dishwashing liquid to wash fruits and vegetables. Now, there's nothing on this label that suggests, oh, and by the way, really good for washing broccoli. And yet, what happened? These very smart, really capable brand people from P&G did a smart thing. They could have just looked and thought, oh my God, these crazy people, they're washing fruits and vegetables with Dawn dishwashing liquid. In other words, they could have seen the gorilla and just ignored it and dismissed it, but they didn't. They remembered that Isaac Asimov quote and they went, that's funny. And eventually, that original insight led to the development of a completely new product called Fit that is formulated and branded expressly for people who want to wash fruits and vegetables. And again, that might have happened, but it only happened because people looked at some initially unexpected behavior and said, that's funny. Okay, last example I want to quickly share with you comes right from my 1010 class. A few years ago, there was a group of 4 guys, and I promise I'm not being sexist when I say guys, and even better, they were athletes, and you'll hear why that matters. And they wanted to do something in the nutrition space. And they hit a little bit of an impasse, and we talked about it, and I said, you know what, go do some more bottom-up research in the Whole Foods market down on Waterman Street. Just go hang out in the nutrition aisle for like the afternoon and observe people. Maybe ask a few open-ended questions, just get them talking, and see what you find out. And they came running back to me after an afternoon of doing it. They said, Professor Warshay, we think we're onto something. We saw a whole bunch of women coming into the nutrition aisle at Whole Foods looking like this. And I said, what do you mean this? And they said, well, for the most part, they were pregnant. They were pulling bottles of vitamins off the shelf that we learned are called prenatal vitamins. And these are vitamins that we also learned women who are pregnant or even just sexually active looking to get pregnant have to take for the health of their babies. And I said, so what's the problem? And they said, well, we don't know anything about this field, but we asked them some just basic questions to get them talking, and they said, we hate taking these vitamins. They taste terrible. They're huge horse pills, tough to swallow. They exacerbate our nausea. They make us constipated. They're embarrassing to tote around and to broadcast to everybody that we're pregnant or looking to get pregnant. And so, long story short, that insight, that bottom-up research insight, led to their developing a whole range of new products. I put them in touch with some product development people. They reformulated the whole mechanism for taking prenatal vitamins into these very convenient powder packs that you can rip open, dispense into any beverage you're used to taking. They're discreet, so you can carry them and not broadcast to the world that you're pregnant. They taste great. They're not tough to swallow. They don't make you constipated. They don't exacerbate your nausea. And that team won the equivalent of the Brown Venture Prize competition. They won the Rhode Island Business Plan competition. They raised at the time and since almost $10 million in venture capital. And Dan Azes, who's still the CEO, has his headquarters just down the hill, still in Providence. And that eventually led to their doing more bottom-up research and developing new insights into additional unmet needs, serving similar populations, and they're able to develop a whole range of additional products. One thing that's especially acute about Dan is how empathetic he is. And if you go to their website, you see pretty much the definition of what Hannah said before is our metaphor for empathy. We listened and we learned. And if you think about it, this is why the fact that these are 4 guys makes the story so much juicier. These guys, as far as I know, are never going to be the target consumer for these products. And so again, a good reinforcement of that adage, the benefits of scarce resources. They knew less, not more, than the incumbent vitamin manufacturers, and now they are outselling most of the best-selling competitive products in the form of a pill. Now, one thing to mention about Dan is that sometimes life experience will hone our empathy. And Dan had an experience when he was an early teenager that did that. He was a star hockey player in Canada as a young teenager, destined to be drafted into the NHL. And one summer, he was wakeboarding behind a boat at a friend's lake house, and accidentally the rope got wrapped around his neck, and he was jerked behind the boat, and he broke his neck. He ended up face down in the water, paralyzed. And thankfully, somebody was with him and knew enough to right him, get him breathing. He had a life-saving operation and was pretty much good as new, with one exception, which is that he had one of his cervical vertebrae fused, and the doctors warned him that he shouldn't do any more contact sport. And so Dan, when he got to Brown, was still a heck of an athlete. And so he joined the men's crew team. Because if you think about it, you don't have to move your neck. You don't have to have contact with anybody. You just have to stare backwards and row like hell. And his men's crew team won the NCAA championships. Now, I certainly don't wish that form of empathy training on anybody. And it's understandable, perhaps, that Dan is a little bit more acutely empathetic than many others. But all of us can be empathetic. We can all put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. I want to make sure that you realize, and that's true for any kind of industry, real estate, business to business, service business, online, offline, all through the supply chain, there are lots of places that we can and should do bottom-up research. The 3 examples I shared are a little bit more accessible because we're consumers of all kinds of products, but you can and you should do bottom-up research everywhere in the supply chain. The last thing I want to say, I'll end with an adage, relates to some bottom-up research training I was doing in South Africa for a very large consumer products company that sells health and beauty products, shampoos, soaps, lotions. And by the end of the training, a room full of people, I had them. I just knew they couldn't wait to go out and do bottom-up research. And then one woman from the back of the room raised her hand. She said, you know, I am totally sold. I can't wait to go do this. The problem is I'm in charge of our shampoo line. And you've told us to be an anthropologist and go observe people using our product naturally. And the challenge is that people use my product naked in the shower. And so how am I supposed to go observe them empathetically? I said, that's a bit of a challenge. But we workshopped it, and one other woman from the other side of the room, very smart, said, you know, it occurs to me that part of our product line is shampoos meant for newborn babies. And I bet we could more likely ask permission of parents to go watch them shampoo their newborn babies. And that's what they did. And they discovered some interesting insights, like the fact that people in this part of South Africa were using the same shampoo to wash down the tubs and the sinks where they were washing their baby's hair. And that was a really important insight. The adage I want to leave you with is don't let perfection be enemy of the good. Which means even if you can't think of a perfect, idealistic way to do bottom-up research the way I've described it in these 3 admittedly sort of fairy tale examples, do some. And do it even imperfectly. And do it often. And like Tide and the P&G people, don't stop doing it. Because any amount you do will be beneficial for whatever kind of new opportunity you're looking to engage in. And remember, it starts with finding and validating the unmet need. And this is one of the most significant ways to engage to do that. Okay. I'm sensitive to your time, and I want to make sure that we don't overdo it. But if we have a few minutes, is there any question, comment, concern that anybody has that would be on your mind? And maybe Oscar and others from my class who've done this, and maybe others have, can explain a little bit about how you did it. But I'm not putting you on the spot. That's not a cold call.
We're obviously in a real estate class. How would you say you do bottom-up research in a real estate class when it's...
How might you imagine it? I'll turn the question back to you, and then I'll tell you what I think. But
I mean, it'd be hard to sort of... I guess you'd have to find someone's need. Like, I guess, making a building, you have to understand what the need of the building would be first. I don't know, it's quite a physical thing and a bit large-scale thing, so it'd be hard to...
Maybe. Any other thoughts about how we might do this in a real estate class? Yeah. A 10-10 team member, so
yeah.
Yes, you can answer the question for your team member.
Well, I mean, you can look to see if there's a demand for residential or office space in a certain area. You kind of see what people in that area want, so it's like tech related or potentially something else, and then maybe like for retail in the same space or building, if there's not a Starbucks there, that's kind of an arbitrary one, but if there's something that's needed or wanted, that could help in just kind of walk around?
Good, yeah. I mean, maybe similar to the Pre-Mama team. You could immerse yourself in an environment where you're going to observe people. You're going to watch what are their acute needs. Maybe you prompt them, not with too much leading the witness, but a little bit of an open-ended question. Where do you live? Where do you work? You get people riffing, you get people talking. I would imagine, I don't have a lot of experience doing this in the real estate field, but I would imagine it's absolutely critical, because the worst thing would be to build an entire building thinking that you're going to address the need of people in that environment, and you realize too late that, whoops, that wasn't the need at all. You know, we thought it was commercial and it's actually a residential need, or it's commercial but it's not the right kind of commercial. So I would think that in real estate, it's even more important than in many industries where you can pivot cost effectively. It's pretty hard to pivot, I think, in terms of changing the use, changing the design of real estate once it's built. So probably even more of a reason to do it. I'm not sure it's easy, but again, let's not let perfection be enemy of the good. I'd say, to the extent you wanted to use it even in this class, and I'm not imposing it, I would just start. I wouldn't overthink it. I would put yourself in a position like Dan Azes and his team had no idea what they would find in the treasure hunt of hanging out in Whole Foods for that day. And now it's, like 12 years later. And I think Dan's pretty happy that he spent that afternoon doing it. It doesn't cost anything. You don't need any more training than what you've gotten this afternoon. You don't need any more sophistication. That's the problem with the P&G examples that I used to give, because I worried at one point that I was implying that you had to be P&G and that you needed their cost structure and their expertise, their pedigree, their brands. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reason I love telling the Dan Azes story is Dan was a student at Brown, just like you. And the people who I see doing bottom-up research the most effectively are my Brown students. And again, I think it's because you have less training, not more. That's a good question. Jay?
Do you think that, going back to the Tide example, do you think that, some 18-year-old kid sitting at home could have noticed his mom stabbing the Tide box with a knife and said, let's do something about laundry detergent, but he just didn't kind of have the detergent on his mind?
Yes. So clearly, the brand people watching this weren't the only people in the world ever to have seen somebody open a box like that. Lots of people did. The incumbent competitors to Pre-Mama, for sure they knew that there were some problems with the way people experienced their pills. They may have just assumed that's the way it always has to work. So that 18-year-old kid at home, or Dan Azes and his team in my class, or all of you in this real estate class, you can look at the world with fresh eyes and see things even that other people are seeing, but seeing them in a way that can lead to insights that others may not draw. And so that's, to me, the exciting thing about students doing entrepreneurship at a place like Brown, is you have the capability of relaxing biases that you haven't built up yet, or at least not as much. People in the mattress industry don't see what the Casper people see. At least they don't really see it. They may see the gorilla, but not in real terms, or they really miss the gorilla. The prenatal vitamin companies in the time when Dan noticed the problems, they may have missed the gorilla completely, or they may have seen it and dismissed it. The Dawn dishwashing liquid people may have seen people doing washing broccoli with Dawn dishwashing liquid and had a choice. Do we pay attention or not? So it's almost never that there's a unique insight that somebody sees just themselves. The question is, do you really notice it? And then what are you going to do about it? Maybe time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
On the topic of applying the bottom-up research process to real estate, can you talk through the process of building the building that we're currently sitting in and how you apply that methodology to this?
Great, I love that question. Yeah, we are in the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship. And we had 3 years to do that kind of insight building, finding and validating unmet needs before we put up this building. And I don't take credit for putting it up. But before we even contributed to it. Every week we met with the fantastic architects, 2 professors from RISD, with facilities, with construction people. And I made sure, I said, we have to follow our own process. So we listened, I hope well, to EP heads, your predecessors. We had to borrow spaces before this building was built, and so we could observe people trying to configure those spaces into use for their own venture space, for their own lecture spaces. I don't know that we did it perfectly, but one insight that was really bottom up was that we should have ultimate flexibility, students should have ultimate flexibility in how the building configures and reconfigures itself on the fly, in the moment, over time. And the reason was we couldn't possibly predict all the ways that people needed to have fixed spaces. And in fact, the way that students need the space is to be able to feel empowered to configure it themselves. That was the most important insight, I think, that we gathered through that bottom-up research. And it relieved us of the pressure of trying to have a crystal ball to predict absolutely the way this space, every nook and cranny, had to be configured. The adage I always use, and that I told our architects, was don't pour the concrete in the sidewalks until you see the bare patches on the lawn. And that pretty much meant I have no idea from 1 minute to the next how people need to use this space, and so we have to empower them with that ultimate flexibility to configure it 1 minute to the next. This room looks very different depending on multiple times a day when you're in here. All the venture spaces, the walls move, these walls move, the furniture moves, you can write on all the walls. That principle is not something that I think any of us would have known if we had been charged with building a building on our very first day back in the fall of 2016. So investing that time, that first 55 minutes, like Albert Einstein said, was absolutely essential to our being able to configure this space to meet the needs of students who are our primary constituent. Okay, I want to really thank John for having me in my own space today, but having me be with you. It's a real privilege to be here with some of my former students. I love meeting new students. I hope you will take to heart the 3-step process that we teach through our center, through 1010, through real estate and other courses. If you have a thirst to learn more, there's all sorts of ways to do that through the Nelson Center, in the classroom, as you know, out of the classroom, and through venture support. If you aren't already on our email list, I'll plug it by saying go to entrepreneurship.brown.edu, sign up. Thanks very much, everyone.